November 25, 1997, Estadio Monumental, Buenos Aires. Carlos Mendoza had been Diego Maradona's head of security for 8 years, the man Diego trusted with his life. That's exactly why the phone call came to him at 11:47 p.m. Carlos, get to the stadium, now, and bring the cleanup crew. 23 people saw Maradona enter that stadium that night. Only Carlos saw him leave, in a body bag. What happened in those missing 4 hours became Argentina's most protected secret. The government buried the files, the witnesses disappeared. And for 26 years, when people talked about Maradona's final years, they never mentioned November 25th, the night Carlos chose silence over truth, the night he learned some legends are worth more dead than alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the cafe windows like bullets from the past. Carlos Mendoza wiped down the same coffee cup for the 3rd time, his weathered hands trembling, not from age but from the photograph lying face down on the counter beside him. 26 years of carefully constructed peace, shattered by a single piece of paper slipped under his door at dawn. The cafe was empty except for the ghosts. It was always empty these days. Café del Puerto sat on a forgotten corner of Montevideo's old district, serving bitter coffee to dock workers and the occasional lost tourist. Carlos preferred it that way. Anonymity was a luxury he'd paid for with everything he'd once loved. He flipped the photograph over again, though he'd memorized every pixel. Grainy, shot from a distance, but unmistakably him. November 25, 1997. Carlos Mendoza, head of security, dragging something wrapped in white sheets toward a waiting ambulance. In the background, the iconic silhouette of Estadio Monumental pierced the Buenos Aires skyline. The photographer had captured the exact moment Carlos became a dead man walking. A bell chimed as the front door opened. Carlos's hand instinctively moved toward the knife beneath the register. Old habits from a different life. But it was just Mrs. Hernandez from the flower shop, seeking refuge from the storm. Terrible weather, Carlos. The usual, please. He nodded, muscle memory guiding him through the motions of preparing her cortado. Steam hissed from the espresso machine, drowning out the sound of his racing heartbeat. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the photograph. Who else had seen it? Who else knew? Mrs. Hernandez settled into her corner table with yesterday's newspaper, oblivious to the fact that she was drinking coffee made by a man who'd helped orchestrate the greatest deception in football history. Carlos envied her ignorance. There was a time when he'd slept soundly, too. The phone rang. Carlos stared at it, remembering another call, another lifetime. After 6 rings, he answered. Café del Puerto. Silence. Then a voice, heavily accented Portuguese. Carlos Mendoza? His blood turned to ice. Who's asking? My name is Rafael Santos. I'm a journalist from Sao Paulo. I think we should talk. Carlos's grip tightened on the receiver. I don't talk to reporters. Not even about your daughter? The words hit like a physical blow. Isabella, his little girl who wasn't little anymore, who hadn't spoken to him since the divorce, who'd built her own life in Buenos Aires, climbing the ranks of the Argentine Football Association, completely unaware that her father's sins were buried beneath every field she worked to improve. What about her? Carlos's voice barely rose above a whisper. She's got quite a career ahead of her. New promotion, I hear. Deputy Director of Stadium Operations. Funny how she ended up working with the same stadiums you used to clean. Through the window, Carlos spotted a black sedan parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine running. How long had it been there? What do you want? Justice for my brother, Miguel Santos. Ring any bells? The name hit Carlos like a sledgehammer. Miguel Santos, the photographer who'd been too curious for his own good, the one who'd asked too many questions about security protocols and emergency procedures, the one who disappeared 3 weeks after that November night, leaving behind only a camera bag floating in the Rio de la Plata. I don't know any Miguel Santos. Rafael's laugh was cold, humorless. 36 years old, freelance photographer for Clarin, last seen November 30th, 1997. You really don't remember the man whose life you destroyed? Carlos's hand shook as he reached for the photograph again. In the corner, barely visible, was a timestamp, 11:53 p.m. 6 minutes after the call that changed everything. 6 minutes after Diego Maradona's world and Carlos's came crashing down. I was doing my job. Your job was protecting Maradona. But you couldn't protect him from himself, could you? So you protected the legend instead. The sedan's door opened. A tall man emerged, collar turned up against the rain. Even from this distance, Carlos could see the family resemblance, the same sharp jawline Miguel Santos had possessed. 26 years, Carlos. 26 years I've been looking for the truth about what happened to Miguel. And now I have it. The truth died that night. Did it? Because I have footage that says otherwise. 4 hours of security camera recordings that somehow never made it into the official report. Recordings that show exactly what happened in that stadium. And more importantly, who else was there? Carlos felt the walls closing in. The cafe suddenly seemed smaller, the rain louder, the photograph heavier. He'd spent 26 years running from that night, but the past had finally caught up. Check your phone, Carlos. I've sent you a preview. The line went dead. Carlos's phone buzzed with an incoming message, a video file, 17 seconds long. His finger hovered over the play button, knowing that whatever he saw would determine whether he lived through the next 24 hours. Outside, Rafael Santos walked toward the cafe, and Carlos realized his ordinary world was about to burn. Carlos's finger remained frozen above the play button as Rafael Santos's silhouette grew larger through the rain-streaked window. The 17 seconds of footage felt like a loaded gun pointed at everything he'd built in Montevideo. This small, careful life of measuring coffee beans and avoiding eye contact with customers who might recognize his face from old newspapers. Mrs. Hernandez looked up from her paper, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Everything all right, dear?" "Fine," Carlos managed, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. He slipped the phone into his pocket without watching the video. Not yet, not with witnesses. The bell chimed again as Rafael entered, shaking rain from his jacket. He was younger than Carlos had expected, maybe 45, with the lean build of a man who'd spent years chasing stories through dangerous places. His eyes swept the cafe with professional assessment before settling on Carlos behind the counter. "Coffee?" Carlos asked, though they both knew this wasn't about caffeine. "Black. Brazilian roast, if you have it." Rafael's Spanish carried the musical cadence of Portuguese, the same accent that had haunted Carlos's nightmares. Miguel had sounded exactly the same. Mrs. Hernandez gathered her things, suddenly eager to leave. She'd lived through enough turmoil in her 78 years to recognize when trouble walked through a door. Carlos envied her ability to simply walk away. He prepared the coffee with deliberate slowness, buying time to think. The espresso machine's familiar rhythm usually calmed him. It was the soundtrack of his exile, the proof that he'd successfully become nobody. But today, each hiss of steam sounded like the oxygen tanks they'd wheeled into the stadium that night, too late to save anyone. "You've got a nice place here," Rafael said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "Quiet, private, perfect for a man who wants to disappear." Carlos set the cup down without meeting his eyes. Through the window, he could see the black sedan, empty now. Rafael had come alone, but that didn't mean he was working alone. "Your daughter called you last week." The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He gripped the counter's edge, knuckles white. "I don't." Thursday night, 9:47 p.m. 17 minutes. First time in 8 months. Rafael sipped his coffee, watching Carlos's reaction. "She's worried about you." The divorce was hard on her, watching her hero father become this. Carlos's throat constricted. Isabella had called, drunk on wine and success, telling him about her promotion, deputy director of stadium operations for the Argentine Football Association. She'd been proud, wanting to share the moment with the man who'd first taught her to love the beautiful game. He'd listened to her voice, older now, professional, but still carrying traces of the little girl who used to braid his shoelaces before matches, and felt his heart break all over again. She had no idea that her new position would put her in the same rooms, the same stadiums where her father had committed the sin that destroyed their family. "She thinks you left because you couldn't handle the pressure anymore," Raphael continued. "Because seeing Maradona struggle with addiction reminded you too much of your own demons. That's the story your ex-wife told her anyway." Carlos remembered Elena's face the last time he'd seen her, hollow-eyed and brittle with the weight of secrets she couldn't share. Elena, who'd known something was wrong but never pressed for details, who'd watched him wake up screaming for 2 years before finally asking him to leave. Elena protected her, Carlos whispered. Let Isabella hate me instead of learning the truth. Noble. Stupid but noble. Raphael leaned forward. But lies have a way of catching up, don't they? Especially when the liar gets promoted to oversee the very stadium where it all happened. The rain had softened to a steady patter, but Carlos could barely hear it over the roaring in his ears. Isabella working at Estadio Monumental, walking the same tunnels, the same emergency corridors he'd used that night. How long before someone made the connection? How long before her name became linked to his? "What do you want?" Carlos asked again. "I told you. Justice for Miguel. Your brother made his choice. He should have walked away." "Like you did?" Raphael's voice hardened. "Except you didn't just walk away, Carlos. You helped them clean up the mess. You made sure the greatest footballer in history died a hero instead of... What was it the autopsy would have shown? Cocaine? Alcohol or something worse?" Carlos closed his eyes, remembering the weight of Maradona's body, the way Diego's face had looked peaceful despite everything, like a child finally allowed to rest. The man who'd carried Argentina's dreams had been carrying too much, and when he'd finally fallen, Carlos had made sure he fell upward into legend instead of down into scandal. "Miguel had photos, didn't he?" Raphael pressed. "Before you found him..." Carlos's phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, a photo of Isabella leaving her apartment building in Buenos Aires, taken this morning. She was smiling, carrying coffee and newspapers, completely unaware that her past was closing in. The message was clear. Rafael Santos hadn't just found Carlos. He'd found everything Carlos had left to lose. Carlos stared at the photo of Isabella, his daughter's smile like a knife through his chest. The coffee cup in his hand began to shake, dark liquid sloshing against porcelain. "You're threatening her." "I'm showing you the stakes." Raphael's voice remained calm, but his eyes had turned predatory. "Watch the video, Carlos. 17 seconds that will change everything." Carlos's thumb moved to his phone, muscle memory overriding rational thought. The video began to play, and 26 years collapsed into nothing. Security camera footage, black and white, timestamp November 25, 1997, 11:53 p.m. The emergency corridor beneath Estadio Monumental. Carlos watched himself appear on screen, but he wasn't alone. 2 figures flanked him as they carried the white-wrapped body. One he recognized as Dr. Herrera, the team physician who'd signed the death certificate. The other made his blood freeze. Eduardo Vargas, the AFE president's chief of staff, the man who'd orchestrated everything. But that wasn't what made Carlos's hands shake. In the corner of the frame, partially hidden behind a concrete pillar, was a third figure, watching, waiting. A man Carlos had thought was in Sao Paulo that night, managing a business deal that would keep him away from the stadium. "Impossible," Carlos whispered. "Keep watching." The hidden figure stepped into frame for exactly 3 seconds. Tall, elegant, wearing an expensive coat. A man whose political career had been built on the foundation of Maradona's heroic death. A man who'd parlayed his grief over losing Argentina's greatest son into a seat in Congress, then the Senate, then a run for governor of Buenos Aires. Congressman Roberto Mendez. The same Roberto Mendez whose campaign Carlos had secretly followed from Montevideo, watching as the politician climbed higher and higher on the ladder of power. He was supposed to be in Sao Paulo, Carlos said, more to himself than Raphael. He was, until 10:30 that night, when he took a private jet back to Buenos Aires. Miguel tracked the flight logs before he disappeared. Raphael leaned closer. "The question is, Carlos, why did Roberto Mendez need to be at the stadium that night? And why did he stay hidden until after Maradona was already dead?" The video looped, and Carlos watched the scene again. This time, he noticed something else. The timestamp showed 11:53, but Maradona had been declared dead at 11:45. 8 minutes. For 8 minutes, Roberto had been in that stadium before Carlos arrived with the body. Diego was supposed to be alone that night, Carlos said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Private meeting with sponsors, no security, no media. Except Miguel was doing a feature on stadium architecture. He had permission to photograph the building after hours. Rafael's voice carried the weight of years spent reconstructing the truth. He saw Mendez enter through the very important person entrance at 11:20, saw him leave through the service tunnel at 11:58, 5 minutes after you cleared the scene. Carlos felt the cafe walls closing in. 26 years of believing he'd covered up an accidental overdose, an aging football god's final surrender to his demons. But if Roberto had been there before Diego died, you think Roberto killed him. I think Roberto needed Diego dead. The World Cup hosting rights were being decided the next month. Diego had been asking too many questions about bribes, about fixed matches. He was unstable, unpredictable. Rafael pulled out a worn notebook, flipping to pages covered with Miguel's handwriting. Miguel had been tracking it for months. The corruption went all the way to the top, and Diego was about to expose everything. Carlos's phone buzzed. Another photo of Isabella, this one taken an hour ago. She was entering the AFA headquarters in Buenos Aires, the same building where Roberto Mendez now served as a special advisor. She's working directly under him, Carlos realized. Deputy Director reports to the Stadium Operations Committee. 3-person committee. Roberto chairs it. Rafael's smile was sharp as broken glass. Funny how these things work out. The rain outside had stopped, but Carlos felt like he was drowning anyway. He'd spent 26 years believing he'd protected a legend's reputation. Instead, he'd helped a killer build a political empire. And now that killer was positioned directly above Carlos's daughter. What do you want from me? The truth about what you saw that night, about who gave you orders to clean up the scene, about what really happened in those missing 8 minutes. Rafael closed Miguel's notebook, because in 3 days, Roberto Mendez announces his run for governor. And in 3 days, I publish this story, with or without your cooperation. Carlos looked around his cafe, at the life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. Tomorrow, none of this would exist. Whether he helped Rafael or not, the world was about to learn that Carlos Mendoza wasn't a broken ex-security chief hiding in Uruguay. He was an accessory to murder, and his daughter was working for the man who'd killed Diego Maradona. Carlos stood frozen behind the counter, the weight of 26 years pressing down on his shoulders like the concrete ceiling of Estadio Monumental. Rafael's ultimatum hung in the air between them. 3 days to confess or watch his daughter's world explode on the front page of every newspaper in South America. I need time to think, Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rafael's laugh was bitter. Miguel didn't get time. He got a bullet and a river grave. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. You have until Friday, then the story runs. After Rafael left, Carlos locked the cafe's front door and flipped the sign to closed. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Eduardo Vargas, the architect of the cover-up, now retired and living quietly in Mar del Plata. The phone rang 6 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Sí, Eduardo. It's Carlos Mendoza." Silence stretched between them, filled with shared ghosts. When Eduardo finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd been expecting this call for decades. "I told you never to contact me. We have a problem. Rafael Santos, Miguel's brother. He has footage from that night." Carlos heard something crash in the background, followed by Eduardo's sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible. We destroyed everything." "Not everything. He showed me security camera footage. Roberto was there, Eduardo, before we arrived. The timeline doesn't match what we were told." Another long silence. When Eduardo spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper. "Don't say his name on this line. Meet me tonight. The old pier in Punta del Este. Come alone. Eduardo. 11 o'clock. And Carlos?" Eduardo's voice cracked. "Bring a gun." The line went dead, leaving Carlos staring at his phone. In 30 years of friendship, Eduardo had never shown fear. Not during military coups, not during death threats from rival football factions, not even that night in November when they'd carried Maradona's body through the tunnel like pallbearers for a saint. Carlos climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment above the cafe, each step feeling like a small death. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, Isabella at age 8, wearing his old security badge and grinning with gap-toothed pride. He'd told her that day that his job was protecting heroes. She'd asked if that made him a hero, too. He pulled a wooden box from beneath his bed, his fingers finding the combination he'd memorized but prayed never to use. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a Glock 19, standard issue from his AFA days. The weight felt foreign in his hands, heavier than he remembered. His phone rang, and Isabella's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, Carlos considered letting it go to voicemail. How could he speak to her now, knowing what he knew about Roberto? But paternal instinct overrode self-preservation. "Papa." Isabella's voice was strained, uncertain. "I know we haven't talked since my promotion call, but I need to ask you something." Carlos's throat constricted. "What is it, mi amor?" "Roberto Mendez pulled me aside today. He was asking questions about you, about why you really left Buenos Aires." She paused, and Carlos could hear office noise in the background. Phones ringing, conversations bleeding through thin walls. "He said there were things about that time I should know. About the Maradona case." The room spun around Carlos. Roberto was already moving, already positioning pieces on the board. 26 years of careful distance, and now the killer was whispering poison directly into his daughter's ear. "Isabella, listen to me carefully. Don't trust him. Whatever he tells you about me, about the past, Papa, you're scaring me. What happened back then? Mama always said it was the pressure, but Roberto made it sound like something else, something worse." Carlos closed his eyes, seeing Rafael's footage playing on repeat, Roberto emerging from the shadows like a ghost made flesh. "Where are you now?" "Still at the office. We're reviewing security protocols for Roberto's announcement event on Friday, the press conference where he declares his candidacy." Isabella's voice carried a note of pride that made Carlos's chest ache. "He's asked me to personally oversee stadium security. It's a huge opportunity." Friday, the same day Rafael planned to publish his story. Roberto wasn't just positioning Isabella, he was setting her up to be collateral damage when the truth exploded into the world. "Isabella, I want you to leave Buenos Aires. Tonight." "What? Papa, that's crazy. I can't just—" "Please, trust me. Go stay with your aunt in Cordoba for a few days. Take vacation time. You're not making sense." "Why would I—" A knock at Carlos's door cut her off. Slow, deliberate, with the rhythm of someone who expected to be answered. Carlos moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A black sedan sat in the street below, engine running. "Isabella," he whispered into the phone, "I have to go, but promise me you'll think about what I said. And whatever Roberto tells you, remember that I love you more than my own life." He hung up and approached the door, the Glock heavy in his hand. Through the peephole, he saw a figure in shadows, tall, elegant, wearing an expensive coat that looked exactly like the one from Rafael's footage. Roberto Mendez had come calling. Carlos's hand tightened on the Glock as he stared through the peephole. 26 years collapsed into this single moment, the killer standing casually on his doorstep as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. "I know you're watching, Carlos." Roberto's voice carried through the thin wood, cultured and patient. "We need to talk." The black sedan's engine hummed like a predator's purr. Carlos counted at least 2 silhouettes inside, waiting. He thought of Isabella, still at her office, probably wondering why her father had sounded so desperate, still trusting the man who'd murdered her hero. Carlos opened the door but kept the chain engaged, the Glock hidden behind his back. Through the narrow gap, Roberto's face appeared, older than in the footage, silver threading through his dark hair, but the same cold intelligence in his eyes. "You look well, old friend. Exile suits you. We were never friends." Roberto's smile was winter-thin. "No, but we've shared so much." November 25, 1997, the greatest tragedy in Argentine football history. The night we all became, what's the word? Complicit. Carlos felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Eduardo told us you were in Sao Paulo. Eduardo told you what I needed him to tell you. Roberto stepped closer to the gap, and Carlos caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something metallic. The question is, what has Rafael Santos told you? The casual mention of Rafael's name sent ice through Carlos's veins. You know about him. I've known about Rafael for 26 years, just like I knew about Miguel. Roberto's voice dropped to a whisper. Some stories are too dangerous to tell, Carlos. Some truths are worth killing for. Through the gap, Carlos saw Roberto glance at his watch, the same gesture he'd made countless times during AFA board meetings, a man who valued punctuality even in murder. My daughter doesn't know anything. Your daughter knows enough. Roberto pulled out his phone, showing Carlos a photo. Isabella in the stadium tunnel, examining security camera positions. The same tunnel where they'd carried Maradona's body. She's very thorough, just like her father, already asking questions about camera blind spots, about why certain files from 1997 are classified above her clearance level. Carlos's vision blurred with rage. Isabella wasn't just working for Roberto. She was unknowingly investigating her own father's crime. The irony was perfect, vicious. She inherited your instincts, Carlos, that dedication to truth that made you such an excellent head of security. Roberto's smile turned predatory. It's going to get her killed. The chain lock felt flimsy as paper between them. Carlos could shoot Roberto right here, right now, end 26 years of fear with a single trigger pull. But the men in the sedan would kill him instantly, and Isabella would never learn why her father had suddenly become a murderer. What do you want? The same thing I wanted that night in November. Silence. Roberto pocketed his phone. Rafael Santos dies before Friday. Eduardo Vargas dies before Friday. And you, Roberto paused, considering. You get to live with your choices a little longer. I won't kill for you. You already have. Roberto's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Every day you stayed silent, Miguel's family suffered. Every year you let me build my political career on Diego's grave, you were my accomplice. You think exile absolves you? You think distance makes you innocent? Carlos remembered the funeral, hundreds of thousands weeping in the streets of Buenos Aires, a nation mourning their fallen god. He'd watched from his apartment window, knowing the truth would destroy every tear, every prayer, every moment of genuine grief. Diego was going to expose the World Cup bribes, Carlos said. That's why you killed him. Diego was going to destroy Argentine football. 20 years of progress, of building our reputation, of showing the world we could host global events without corruption scandals. Roberto's mask slipped for a moment, showing the fanatic beneath. One man's conscience against a nation's dreams. I made the right choice. You made a killer's choice. We all made killer's choices that night. The only difference is I'm honest about mine. Roberto stepped back from the door. You have 48 hours, Carlos. Rafael dies, or Isabella learns exactly what kind of man her father really is, and then she joins him. The black sedan's doors opened, men emerging like shadows given form. Carlos watched Roberto walk away with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own righteousness. The car disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of diesel engines and the weight of an impossible choice. Carlos locked the door and slumped against it, the Glock sliding from nerveless fingers. 48 hours to become a killer or watch his daughter die for his sins. 26 years of running, and the past had finally cornered him in a cafe that smelled like coffee and regret. His phone buzzed with a text from Eduardo, meeting canceled. They know, run. But there was nowhere left to run except toward the truth. Carlos stared at Eduardo's text message, his thumb hovering over the reply button. But before he could type a response, another message appeared, this one from an unknown number. Eduardo can't help you anymore. R. The phone slipped from Carlos's fingers, clattering against the wooden floor. The sound echoed through the empty cafe like a gunshot, and suddenly Carlos understood with crystalline clarity that Eduardo wasn't just scared, he was dead. 26 years of believing he'd covered up an accidental overdose. 26 years of guilt over protecting a legend's reputation. But as Carlos picked up his phone with trembling hands, the real truth began assembling itself like pieces of a puzzle he'd been too blind to see. Eduardo hadn't called him that night in November to help clean up Maradona's mess. Eduardo had called him to clean up Roberto's. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered, remembering that night with new eyes. Eduardo's hands had been shaking when they met at the stadium service entrance, not from grief, from terror, and when Eduardo had handed him the security footage to destroy, his instructions had been specific: don't watch it, just burn it. Carlos had assumed it was to protect Diego's dignity. Now he realized Eduardo was protecting himself from becoming Roberto's next victim. The phone rang in his hands, Isabella's number. Carlos's finger hesitated over the accept button. How could he explain that everything she believed about her father's fall from grace was built on lies, that the man she was working for had orchestrated it all? "Papa?" Isabella's voice was different now, strained with a fear that made Carlos's chest constrict. "I'm at the stadium. Something's wrong with the security system. All the cameras from 1997 are showing up in the maintenance logs, but the files are gone. Where are you exactly?" "Tunnel B, near the memorial wall. Roberto asked me to do a comprehensive audit of our archive storage." Isabella paused, and Carlos could hear her footsteps echoing through concrete corridors. "Papa, there's something else. I found a personnel file with your name on it, but it's not your regular employment record. It's marked Special Operations, and the signature at the bottom." Carlos closed his eyes, knowing what she was about to say. "It's Roberto's signature, but it's dated 3 days before Maradona died. Why would Roberto be signing your security assignments when he wasn't even supposed to be involved with stadium operations?" The lie Eduardo had fed him 26 years ago crumbled completely. Roberto hadn't been an outsider who'd helped cover up an accident. He'd been running Carlos like an asset, positioning him exactly where he needed to be when Diego died. "Isabella, listen to me very carefully. Leave the stadium right now. Don't ask questions, don't finish your work, just walk out." "I can't just leave. Roberto specifically asked me to." Isabella's voice cut off abruptly. When she spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "Papa, someone just entered the tunnel. I can hear voices." Carlos pressed the phone against his ear, straining to catch any sound from Isabella's end. Muffled voices carried through the connection, Roberto's cultured tones, and another voice Carlos recognized with a sick jolt of memory. The same voice that had given him his final orders that November night, telling him his services were no longer required by the AFA, the voice of someone who was supposed to have died in a car accident 6 months after Maradona's death, Miguel Santos. Not killed for threatening to expose the truth. Killed because he'd figured out that Carlos was never meant to be a cover-up artist. He was meant to be the fall guy, the perfect patsy whose guilt would be so obvious that no one would look deeper into Roberto's political connections. "Isabella," Carlos whispered into the phone, "can you hear what they're saying?" A pause. Then Isabella's voice, tight with confusion and growing fear. "They're talking about photographs. About someone named Miguel who saw too much." Another pause. "Papa, why does Roberto keep saying 'just like we planned'? What did you plan?" Carlos felt his world tilt on its axis. Isabella wasn't just investigating old security files. She'd stumbled onto Roberto's real archive. The evidence that would prove Diego's murder wasn't a crime of passion or political necessity. It was a rehearsal. "Roberto's going to kill someone else," Carlos said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Friday's press conference. He's not just announcing his candidacy. What are you talking about?" But Carlos was already moving, grabbing the Glock and his car keys, because he finally understood Roberto's 26-year game. You don't build a political career on one martyred football legend. You build it on a pattern of tragedy that positions you as the only man strong enough to protect Argentina from its enemies. Roberto had been planning another murder, and Carlos had trained his daughter to orchestrate the perfect crime scene. "Isabella," Carlos said, starting his car with one hand while clutching the phone with the other, "whatever you do, don't let Roberto know you heard anything. I'm coming to get you." But the line had already gone dead. Carlos stared at the dead phone, Isabella's name frozen on the screen like an epitaph. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before he threw the device onto the passenger seat and floored the accelerator. The old Honda lurched forward through Montevideo's empty streets, headlights cutting through fog that rolled off the Rio de la Plata like smoke from a funeral pyre. 2 hours to Buenos Aires if he pushed hard. 2 hours to save his daughter from becoming Roberto's next casualty. But even as Carlos gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, he knew he was already too late. Roberto didn't leave loose ends untied, and Isabella had heard too much. The highway stretched ahead like a scar across the landscape, and Carlos found himself remembering the last real conversation he'd had with his daughter. She'd been 22, fresh out of university, burning with the idealism that reminded him too much of himself at that age. She'd wanted to work in sports administration, to help clean up the corruption that plagued Argentine football. He tried to warn her away, gently, without revealing why, but she'd accused him of being a cynic, broken by whatever had happened in 1997. If only she'd known how broken he really was. His phone buzzed against the leather seat. Carlos grabbed it without taking his eyes off the road, expecting Roberto's voice. Instead, he heard Rafael Santos, breathless and desperate. They killed Eduardo, shot him in his apartment an hour ago, made it look like a robbery, but his research is gone. Everything about Diego, everything about that night. Carlos felt something cold settle in his stomach. Where are you? Hiding. But Carlos, before they got to Eduardo, he called me, told me something that changes everything. Rafael's voice cracked. Miguel wasn't just a photographer who witnessed a murder. He was Roberto's partner. The Honda swerved slightly as Carlos processed the words. What are you talking about? Eduardo kept records. Insurance, he called it. Miguel and Roberto had been working together for months before Diego died, planning to frame you for a murder they'd committed together. But Miguel got greedy, wanted a bigger cut of Roberto's political payoff. So Roberto had him killed and stuck to the original plan. Let you think you were covering up an accident while he built his career on Diego's martyrdom. Carlos remembered Miguel's face that November night. Nervous, sweating, but not shocked. Not like someone who'd witnessed a murder. Like someone who'd helped commit one. There's more, Rafael continued. Eduardo found financial records. Roberto's been receiving payments from the same accounts that funded Miguel's photography equipment. Brazilian accounts Carlos. The same people who wanted to discredit Argentine football before the World Cup bidding process. The pieces clicked into place with nauseating clarity. Diego hadn't died because he'd discovered corruption in Argentine football. He'd died because he discovered Roberto was working for Brazil, sabotaging Argentina's World Cup bid from the inside. Miguel's photographs weren't evidence of murder. They were proof of treason. Where's Isabella? Rafael asked. Roberto has her. At the stadium. Carlos pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb past anything resembling safe. Rafael, I need you to do something for me. Contact the Buenos Aires police, Inspector Maria Torres. Tell her Carlos Mendoza is coming home, and I'm bringing evidence of Roberto Mendez's involvement in Maradona's murder. Carlos, wait. But Carlos had already hung up and was dialing another number, one he'd memorized but never called. Roberto's private line. It rang twice before Roberto answered, his voice carrying that same infuriating calm. Carlos, I was wondering when you'd call. Let her go. This is between us. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, this is about a failed security chief who's spent 26 years running from the truth of his own incompetence. Roberto paused, and Carlos could hear stadium acoustics in the background, the echo of empty spaces where ghosts still played football. Your daughter is very talented, Carlos. She found Eduardo's safety deposit box number in less than an hour. Of course, by the time we reach the bank tomorrow, Eduardo won't be available to authorize access. Carlos felt his vision blur with rage. You son of a bitch. Careful, Carlos. Anger makes you sloppy. That's what happened that night with Diego. You got emotional, you made mistakes. That's why you've spent your life believing you killed him. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. I didn't kill Diego. No. But you would have, if I'd asked you to. That's what made you perfect for this role. Your conscience was flexible enough to break, but strong enough to carry guilt. Roberto's laugh was winter wind through empty stands. Diego was already dead when you arrived that night. Heart attack, brought on by the photographs Miguel showed him. Pictures of Brazilian officials transferring money to my accounts. Diego's weak heart couldn't handle learning his trusted colleague was a traitor. Carlos saw the stadium lights growing brighter on the horizon, and for the first time in 26 years, he felt something other than guilt burning in his chest. He felt fury. Carlos pulled into the stadium parking lot with his headlights off, the Honda's engine ticking like a countdown timer in the silence. The fury that had sustained him through 2 hours of reckless driving had crystallized into something harder, more focused. For 26 years, he'd carried Roberto's guilt, believing himself a killer, allowing that lie to destroy his marriage, his relationship with Isabella, his entire life. Now the truth burned through him like acid, eating away everything except the need to end this. The stadium rose before him like a concrete cathedral, its lights casting long shadows across empty parking spaces where thousands had once celebrated Argentina's victories. Carlos checked the Glock's magazine, 6 bullets, and wondered if that would be enough for Roberto and however many men he'd brought. It would have to be. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Tunnel B, come alone. Your daughter wants to see her hero father one last time. Carlos walked through the players' entrance, past faded photographs of Argentina's greatest moments. His security badge, the one Isabella had somehow reactivated for her audit, still worked after all these years. The electronic lock disengaged with a soft click, as if the stadium itself was welcoming him home. The corridors smelled of industrial cleaning solution and old concrete, but underneath those familiar scents Carlos caught something else, fierce sweat and gun oil. Roberto wasn't taking any chances tonight. Tunnel B stretched ahead like a throat, ending at the memorial wall where Diego's bronze plaque gleamed under fluorescent lights. Isabella stood beneath it, her hands zip-tied behind her back, a piece of duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were wide but not panicked. She'd inherited more than his instincts, Carlos realized. She'd inherited his ability to think clearly under pressure. Roberto emerged from the shadows beside the memorial, no longer bothering with his politician's facade. The man facing Carlos wore the expression of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of necessary murder. 26 years. Roberto said conversationally. Do you know how many times I've stood in this exact spot looking at Diego's memorial knowing I put him there? It never gets old, Carlos. That feeling of absolute power over life and death. Carlos kept his hands visible, the Glock tucked into his jacket but easily accessible. Let her go. You have me now. But I've always had you. That's what you never understood. Roberto gestured toward Isabella. Your daughter figured it out, though. Clever girl. Found the real security footage from that night, the backup file even Eduardo didn't know about. Want to see what really happened? Roberto pulled out a tablet, swiping to a video file. The screen showed the stadium's medical room, dated November 25, 1997. Carlos watched himself enter the frame, younger, more naive, believing he was helping cover up an accidental overdose. But the timestamp showed he'd arrived 15 minutes after Diego's actual death. On the screen, Roberto appeared, calmly arranging Diego's body, positioning the empty syringe that would make the scene look like a drug overdose. Miguel Santos was there too, taking photographs not of evidence, but of Roberto's staging, insurance photos, to keep Roberto honest about their financial arrangement. Miguel was blackmailing you, Carlos said. Miguel was a business partner who forgot his place. Roberto paused the video at the moment Carlos entered the frame. Look at your face, Carlos. So eager to help, so ready to believe you were protecting Diego's legacy. You never questioned why I needed you there if Eduardo was already handling everything. The truth hit Carlos with devastating clarity. Roberto hadn't needed his help with the cover-up. Roberto had needed a witness. Someone whose reputation for integrity would make the staged suicide believable. Someone whose guilt would be so obvious that no investigation would look deeper. You've been planning this for 26 years, Carlos said. Not just Diego's murder, my daughter's. Roberto smiled. Isabella's death will be tragic but necessary. A corruption investigator, killed by the same forces that murdered her father's career. It will guarantee my election and finally put this whole sordid business to rest. Carlos saw Isabella's eyes narrow above the duct tape. She was trying to tell him something, shifting her weight slightly toward the memorial wall. Following her gaze, Carlos spotted what she'd noticed, a security camera positioned to capture the entire tunnel. This conversation was being recorded. "The camera's live streaming," Roberto said, following Carlos's glance. "To my private server, naturally. The footage will show a disgraced former security chief, driven mad by guilt, murdering his own daughter before taking his own life. A perfect ending to a 26-year story." Roberto reached for his weapon, and Carlos moved. The Glock appeared in Carlos's hand with muscle memory older than his exile. Roberto's pistol was half drawn when Carlos's first shot took him center mass, spinning him away from Isabella. The second shot shattered Roberto's wrist as he tried to raise his weapon with his offhand. Roberto collapsed against Diego's memorial, his blood streaking the bronze plaque. "You still don't understand," he gasped. "There are others. This doesn't end with me." Carlos knelt beside his daughter, cutting her restraints with trembling fingers. "It ends with the truth," he said, pulling the tape gently from her mouth. "Finally, it ends with the truth." Isabella's first word was "Papa." Her second was "evidence." Isabella's fingers were steady as she worked Roberto's tablet, uploading the security footage to every major news outlet in South America. Carlos watched his daughter navigate the digital landscape he barely understood, her movements precise despite the rope burns on her wrists. "The live stream captured everything," she said without looking up from the screen. "His confession, the video from 1997, all of it." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "Papa, I'm sorry. For 26 years I believed—" "You believed what everyone was meant to believe." Carlos helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her shoulder. The simple contact felt foreign after so many years of careful distance. Roberto was very good at his job. Police sirens echoed through the stadium corridors, growing louder. Rafael must have reached Inspector Torres. Carlos looked down at Roberto's still form, blood pooling beneath Diego's memorial plaque, and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but emptiness. The man who had stolen his life was dead, but the years between then and now remained irretrievably lost. "He was right about one thing," Isabella said, following his gaze. "There will be others. His financial records show payments from a network that goes back decades. Brazilian intelligence, corrupt FIFA officials, politicians across 3 countries. Carlos nodded. He'd expected as much. Men like Roberto were never the beginning or end of anything. They were simply the visible piece of larger conspiracies. But for the first time in 26 years, that knowledge didn't feel like a weight he had to carry alone. Inspector Torres arrived with a forensics team and enough officers to secure the stadium. She was younger than Carlos had expected, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd earned her position despite obstacles. As she listened to their account, Carlos found himself remembering how he'd once believed in the possibility of justice through proper channels. "The evidence is overwhelming," Torres said after reviewing Isabella's files. "But you understand there will be questions about why you fled to Uruguay, about tonight's shooting." "I understand." Carlos looked at his daughter, who was giving her statement to another detective with the calm professionalism she'd inherited from both parents. "I'm not going anywhere." The investigation consumed the next 3 weeks. Carlos testified before federal prosecutors, gave interviews to journalists, and watched his life dissected in newspapers across the continent. The exile was over, but returning home proved more complicated than simply crossing a bridge. The cafe in Montevideo had to be sold. Carlos couldn't abandon his responsibility to Argentina's justice system, and Isabella needed him nearby as she dealt with the aftermath of Roberto's network. They found Carlos a small apartment in Buenos Aires, 2 subway stops from Isabella's office, and 3 blocks from the cemetery where Ana was buried. On a gray morning in April, Carlos stood at Ana's gravestone for the first time since her funeral. The inscription was simple: Ana Mendoza, beloved mother and teacher. No mention of her status as a widow, no reference to the scandal that had shadowed her final years. "I brought her truth," he said aloud, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. "Not redemption exactly, but truth." Isabella appeared beside him, carrying coffee in paper cups. She handed him one without speaking, and they stood together in the cemetery silence. Their relationship was still careful, still rebuilding, but Carlos no longer felt the desperate need to protect her from his past. The truth had proved more durable than his lies. Roberto's replacement was arrested yesterday, Isabella said eventually. The corruption probe found evidence linking him to match-fixing operations in 5 countries. Carlos nodded. The investigation had grown beyond Roberto's death, becoming a sweeping examination of football corruption throughout South America. Isabella had emerged as a key witness, her technical expertise making her invaluable to prosecutors. She'd found her calling in the pursuit of justice, a path Carlos had abandoned but she'd claimed as her own. The World Cup Committee wants to interview me next month, she continued, about security protocols for the upcoming tournaments. Will you do it? Isabella was quiet for a moment, her breath visible in the cool air. Someone has to clean up this mess. Someone who understands how deeply the corruption runs. Carlos smiled, recognizing his younger self in her determination. But unlike him, Isabella wouldn't have to carry her burden alone. The truth was public now, protected by transparency rather than silence. As they walked back toward the cemetery gates, Carlos felt something he'd forgotten was possible. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The guilt that had driven him into exile was gone, replaced by a different kind of weight. He was a man who'd killed to protect his daughter, who'd spent 26 years believing a lie, who'd lost irreplaceable years with the people he loved. But he was also a father walking beside his daughter in the city where they both belonged, carrying truth instead of secrets. In the arithmetic of damaged lives, that felt close enough to redemption. The stadium lights were visible in the distance, glowing against the gray Buenos Aires sky like a promise that the game would continue.